Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Hines, and it's a pleasure to be here for the first really in-depth module of this training, Legal and Advocacy Training and Support for Civil Society Organizations. This is the first part of Module 2. We're calling it Module 2A, and it deals with the history and the origins of civil society. And the subtitle is, What's in a Name? So, this is what we're going to do in this session. In this session, we will look at some definitions. Civil society organizations, and we will also discuss a bit how these terms have evolved, and we'll continue some of this next week as well when we look at this from a Caribbean perspective and the historical evolution and context of civil society and civil society organizations in particular in the region. We are going to look at terms, civil society organizations, and the relationship between these terms and each other. So the relationship between civil society organizations, and other terms that are used to discuss civil society. So terms like NGOs, the third sector, and so on. And then I am going to ask for you to think about how all of this applies to your work. Is it relevant? How is it relevant? How do you think this potentially adds a level of understanding that may be helpful to what you generally do? So are there any questions for me in particular as a facilitator before we really begin the session? Any questions? No? Okay, so what I would like us to do to start is I want you to think about what civil society means. And if you would like to share what your idea is, you can just raise your hand or just go ahead, jump in and begin speaking. So you all work in a civil society organization, but I want you to tell me what that even means. What is civil society? Anyone want to start? This is where you can unmute and talk.
Okay, since nobody is talking, my understanding of a civil society really is a group of citizens in a particular demographic area that is linked based on their common interests, based on their collective activity and their common ideology and way of living. That is my understanding.
This is Kendron, that's correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Does anybody else want to add to that or have a different opinion?
This is, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, this is Nordia.
Hey, Nordia.
To agree, add to Kendron, it's non-profit, usually non-profit organization, non-political, apart from governments, organizations. Just to add to what Kendron has already said, and it can be any community-based organization, shared interests.
So is this civil society? Is that the meaning of civil society to you? Yes?
Sorry?
Is that what civil society means to you?
Oh, I thought you meant civil society organization.
Is there a difference?
Sorry?
Is there a difference? Anybody can jump in here. Is there a difference between civil society and civil society organization? Are these synonyms? What do you all think?
Hi, this is Valini from SASUD.
Hi.
So I will take a stab at this. Civil society, basically it's non-government or no government, not government related, and civil society has to do with the broader society, and it's now an organization within this broad society addressing specific issues.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Does anyone else want to add anything? Last two comments?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thing 1, 2. All right, I think it has to do with a group of persons with ambitions or aims beyond their individual concern. It
This
has
is
to
David.
benefit society on a whole.
This is Davis speaking.
Did you get that?
Davis?
Yeah, David speaking.
Okay. Do you think it has to do with individual ambitions and goals?
No, it goes beyond individual ambitions and goals.
Okay.
So it embraces societal concerns.
Right. Okay. All right. Anyone else want to be the last one before I continue? No. Okay, this is very good. I'm just going to mute everybody. So if you want to speak again, you have to unmute yourself and I'll continue. All right. So that was pretty good. There are some things I would like to clarify when we think about civil society. So, and there are some differences, some nuances when we consider civil society organizations, what you all work in and represent, and when we consider civil society. So here are some definitions that I pulled from a few places. Civil society is a public space that is separate from the state and the market. Some people will say from the private sector and the public sector, separate from the two of those. And also, I have in brackets here, and political society. That might be a little bit confusing, but when we think about political society now, this is a bit of an in-between area. Here we are thinking about political aspirants in particular. So when we think about those who are trying to take control of the state, in political parties, for instance, they don't sit too well in civil society, because as soon as they win an election or their party is in power, then these individuals start to rest and work within the area that we would consider the state. So political society is a bit different. But in a way, all of us, no matter where we work, what positions we hold, we wear a hat of members of civil society. So some people may argue civil society is just society, yeah? But the word civil is very important in there, and we will focus on this a bit more in our next session. Civil is very important because the idea behind civil society is that we are talking about a certain quality of society, yeah? So civil society is society, it is all of us, mostly independent of the control of the state as well as the market. So when we are operating, as I think Davis said, on the basis of the good of society, or we are working, or we're just existing and thinking about how do we make a better society, what kinds of changes do we need to make in the places in which we live, we are operating within the sphere of civil society. When we do this and we're not part of the government, or we're not doing this for profit, we're not doing this for our business. So civil society is a kind of sphere of social existence. And this next diagram tries to illustrate this a little bit. So the yellow circle, yellowish orange one, see that? I'm going to take out a pointer. there's a bit of a delay between what y'all see and what I do with this pointer. But this one, the state, right? We have the state. And then this little blue that sits in between of the three big circles is what I am saying is political society. Yes, Kendra.
Hi, Erica. Christina, sorry to interject. We're not seeing your screen. We're actually seeing you.
You can only see me.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing the screen, so it has to be, there's something called view options.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if maybe you can.
Oh, I'm actually seeing it now. I'm seeing it now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Would you like me to go back to the previous slide so just so that you can see it?
Please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this one was just the definitions that I discussed. And a sketch of these slides is going to be made available for you all in Google Classroom, so you can go back and look at this in your own time as well. And we also have the recording. Yeah?
Okay, thank you.
That was just a couple of lines that spoke to the definition. And now this next screen, as I was saying, we have this yellow circle here that is the state. And then this one in the middle that says political society, that's the one that I was talking about a little bit. It's kind of difficult to unravel political society as totally separate from the state or civil society or the market or the economy. And that's because, let's say you are in a political party and you are in the youth arm, and you are not standing for election, you are just supporting this political party. In some ways, this youth arm of a political party or the women's arm or wing is part of civil society, but in other ways, they're also, some of the work they do is to help rally support around their political party with the aim of actually forming the state. Yeah? And what we see here is, although we talk about civil society as a sphere that is separate from the state and the market and also political society, in reality, there's a lot of overlapping. How is there this overlap? Well, let's think about things such as funding, for instance. Some organizations will get a government subvention or funding from their own government, perhaps even governments from other countries. There may be funding from private enterprises, from businesses. We have civil society organizations that actually conduct corporate type functions and generate profits, even though they're civil society organizations. And their primary aim is not necessarily to generate profits. Yeah? So there are ways in which we can see this overlap. We can also consider things like, if you think about Chamber of Commerce, for instance, the Chamber of Commerce, the things like the manufacturing society or association, a small business association, this is a civil society organization, and the members, the people who are participating in those organizations, are participating as part of civil society. But their interests, the interests that they're representing while participating in this public sphere, are connected to market-based type interests. So there are these overlaps that exist. And really, I guess that is the case with life, right? Things are not always so black and white, so that there is a strict separation between state, society, civil society, and the market and political society. So that's just a little bit of an illustration to show you all some of the ways that, or one of the principal ways in which civil society has been conceptualized. And you will see this kind of Venn diagram quite often if you go and you do a Google search, for instance. This circle that I put here, can y'all see my cursor? The arrow?
Yes, we can.
Right, so this circle here, I added that one. And to represent this notion of political society kind of hovering in the middle of this. But this is quite a common kind of portrayal of different spheres of social practice. Okay, so let's continue. So, civil society. Civil society is a very old term, and civil society has existed all over the world. One could argue that wherever humans have existed, civil society has existed. But when we try to trace it, and this is common in a lot of what we do in social sciences, when we study terms, especially terms that we get from the English language as a consequence of colonization and all the rest of it, we tend to start with some of the early European foundations or uses of the term. So what I'm trying to say to you here is that civil society is not something that originated in Rome or Greece or anywhere in Europe. But the conceptualization that we tend to use comes from these places because of our intellectual tradition that has a lot to do with certain things, specifically colonization and so on. We don't need to get into that now. But this term, civil society, really, if we do some research, it stems from this term, politicae koinonia, which was translated into Latin as Societas Civiles. I'm not a Latin speaker. And this is what has come to be translated into English as civil society. And what we have in this is a few things. A political society, plural forms of association exist within the sphere called civil society. So inside of civil society, we have koinonia, which is associations or organizations. And this is where we get civil society organizations. Okay? So we have a political society, plural forms of association. And when they talk about a political society, they mean a society that is engaged in public affairs. That's civil society in this early understanding. And this notion of civility, of civilized individuals, which is quite a biased kind of terminology when we consider the origins, because if we go back to this type of society in Greece and in Rome, there are certain people that were considered barbarian and who were considered as uncivil and not part of civilization proper. And this included people of different racial origins, as well as women. But that is also a much bigger discussion than we can go into in an hour. And this part, the next point that I just pulled up, connects to what Davis mentioned, operating towards common goals. So this is not people who are working on the basis of their own personalized self-interest, but towards common goals that emerge from common norms. So norms that exist in society, values that exist in society, a certain collective ethos. But in this early understanding or construction of civil society, what we find that is different from today is that there's no separation between society and poly. So that is, and the state. So there is this view that civil society comprised people who were pulling together towards the same end as the government or the state. So working collectively in support of the state. And if we look at some countries, if we take, in the Caribbean, for instance, we can take Cuba as an example. If you look at some of the studies of civil society and the conduct of the way in which the government attempts to promote civil society organizations in Cuba and even to structure civil society, it is in that way. Civil society that works towards the ends of the state, rather than civil society, and by extension, civil society organizations that challenge the state, that say the government is doing something wrong, that the government needs to change the way in which it operates. And this is the source of, these are the sources of this little historical treatment of civil society. So what we have of this that remains today, these points I just pulled up, are the continued focus on civility. So when we talk about civil society, there's an assumption that we are thinking about people who are going to behave well. So we're not talking about violent kinds of activities. There may be disagreement, but the disagreement can be expressed without violence, without resort to crime. And that is the civil element that remains in this notion of civil society. We still have the centrality of associations, thereby civil society organizations. But we have to remember that civil society organizations are not all that makes up civil society. So when we see social movements, when we see people who take to the street and protest, or who hold a rally, they may not be members of any kind of association or organization, but they're still operating within the realm of civil society. And then there's also this view that civil society has a role to play in governance. But in our contemporary understanding of civil society, we don't necessarily think that this role of civil society in governance has to be supporting the state in whatever it does. Sometimes this role in governance is calling the state to account on certain policy matters, on omissions, on injustices. So even though there are elements that are similar, what we see is that our understanding of civil society today is quite different from earlier Western European conceptions of what civil society was. And there are many, if you really want to do research, there are a lot of European thinkers, Hegel, Marx and Engels. You can look at the liberal tradition of de Tocqueville and so many others who talked about how civil society should work as well, and what would constitute a really good and well-functioning civil society. And these conceptions are quite different across each of them. Today, though, what we find is there is often a conflation between civil society and civil society organizations. So a lot of times when people say civil society, what they're actually talking about is civil society organizations. So sometimes in popular usage, civil society is used to mean civil society organizations. And we even see this by intergovernmental organizations. And when I say intergovernmental organizations, I mean entities like United Nations, the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and so on, as well as governments. We hear governments using, government representatives and operatives using these types of terms. And these are just some examples of some definitions that you can find from intergovernmental organizations that illustrate that. Civil society constitutes the full range of formal and informal organizations that are outside the state and the market. So here we have civil society being viewed as organizations. And as I was saying previously, this is not fully accurate because there is a lot of activity within civil society that does not really revolve around organizations. And we have another one here from the Inter-American Development Bank that again emphasizes organizations, associations, academia, nonprofit, professional and corporate social responsibility groups, and it goes on. So here I'd like to ask you all a question, and this is just simply yes or no question. Did anybody hear about the protests that were happening in Puerto Rico over the last few weeks? They've finished now, but did anyone hear about these, or was anyone following them?
I didn't hear the last part of your question.
I asked if anyone heard about the protests that were occurring in Puerto Rico in July. Did anyone read about those in the papers or see them on the internet or anything?
Yes, I
Yes.
did. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
what is interesting when we look at something like that is that certainly is evidence of very active civil society. But not necessarily, we're not talking about organizations here. So this is why this conflation is not always helpful, because this certainly was civil society taking to the streets for what they believe was the good of Puerto Rico. And they actually were able to have a measure, I say a measure of success in gaining the resignation of the mayor. A measure of success because we don't know what is coming next. But that is just to show you that when we talk about civil society, we don't just mean organizations. If we think back to 2011 and the Arab Spring as well, that can also be taken as an example of the ways in which civil society is not just organization. Okay? Does anyone have a question or comment at this point?
There are times, for example, with the Arab Spring and maybe what happened in Puerto Rico, the aims and objectives may not necessarily be the same with everyone who's agitating. So is that still considered civil society, even if it is taking as it happens?
Oh, definitely. And the reason I would say that is, if you think about organized civil society now, civil society organizations, all organizations don't have the same goals or objectives either. And in a lot of ways, this makes sense because we don't all have, as individuals, the same ideas about how things should work, goals, and objectives. But whatever our ideas are about how society should work, the societies we live in should work, when we voice these and we express these publicly and collectively towards what we conceive as the greater good or the general good, we are operating within the realm of civil society. So there's also this kind of false notion that you often hear this from government representatives, for instance, that say that civil society, the problem with them consulting or including civil society organizations is that they don't speak with one voice, and they need them to speak with one voice. And that is not really always possible because you have various entities within civil society. So here I'm talking about associations or organizations that have different ideas about what should happen. But the governance part is allowing for these voices to contend and to really incorporate them in what happens in society rather than to exclude certain groups. Yeah? So even though there's not always agreement, this does not mean that disagreement negates the functioning of civil society. Does that make sense?
Yes, understood.
Yeah? What do you think?
I actually have a question, if I might.
Somebody has a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
There's, I think, a thin line between the civil society and the activism when it tends to get a little less than civil. Where you might have perhaps a group with a common interest, say, for example, if Puerto Rico became a clash between government and those elements within society that wanted to see better, and it turned into something violent. How do you characterize that then in the context of what we see or understand civil society to be?
Right. So you were dropping out a little bit, but I think I got the essence of what you're saying. So you're asking if when you have protests and so on the street, sometimes elements of it may degenerate into violence. What does that mean for civil society, right? Is that still civil society? Yes. And again, this notion of civility is very important to this understanding of civil society. So that most of what occurs really should happen peacefully. I don't know if anybody has heard of Habermas. Habermas is a European thinker who spoke about discourse ethics. And he talked about the significance of having conversation with each other and not resorting to violence. He's problematic in some ways as well. But there is this idea that that is how civil society should operate. But we can also say that there are some exceptions to this because perhaps people are defending themselves. Right? So self-defense, if you're facing excessive force, self-defense is another matter. And then there are some questions, if you really want to become academic about this, about what constitutes civility and who decides what is violence. Yeah? So is throwing a rock at a building violence if no one is actually harmed? Are these are things such as and when we look next time we come and we talk about in the Caribbean and the non-European world, the ways in which people were excluded from so-called civil society was on the basis of them not being civil and their ways of protesting and so on being uncivilized. So if you hold up your shirt and bare your breast, is that some form of incivility or violence that means you no longer are included in civil society? So yes, there is this thin and very tenuous line. But one of the things that people focus on is the intention. So are you intending to go and do harm, or has this happened because of something breaking down in the protest, if it is a protest that you're going to? The aim should be, if we think about civil society, peaceful. And you may not always get what you want, but the aim should be, it doesn't mean you have to be quiet. You can shout, you can make a lot of noise, but the aim is to really not move into violence as a means and one of the primary methods of your activism. So you are correct. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So this one says, kind of asked, should we just simplify and move on? And this is what a lot of those within the policy realm think that we should do. And because they're like, oh, well, this is a really academic discussion. This is for people like you, right? A doctor, somebody that went and studied, and you want to go into a lot of depth in what's civil society, what does it mean, and all that kind of jargon. But we don't need to know all of that. We just need to simplify. Civil society either is wider society working towards common goals and ends, mostly separate from the state, mostly separate from the market, and or the associations they're in. And so if we simplify, we can move on and create policy, create inclusive structures. So these can be inclusive structures to deal with policy issues like poverty alleviation, to deal with cultural industries or culture in general, to deal with healthcare, education, a whole set of areas. And we can move on to assess the roles of civil society and to provide funding and support for civil society. So one doesn't need to get too caught up in the complexity of civil society or its meaning or civil society organizations. We just need to get on with the business, right? The practical matters of policy creation, funding and support and so on. So that's a perspective, and a perspective that I understand. I don't totally agree with it, but I understand why, if you are operating within a policy realm, or even if you are a civil society organization, you may say, let's just simplify and carry on with the business. All of this is academic concerns that we don't have to get too involved in. And these simplifications make some assumptions. They make assumptions that civil society is good, always good. Good for governance, good for democratization. So this view about civil society being good for democratization in particular comes when we're talking about places that are viewed as authoritarian, and civil society, either as en masse or as civil society organizations, can work towards trying to get things like elections, trying to have more responsive mechanisms and really break down authoritarian regimes and modes of governance. And it also assumes that civil society organizations in particular are good because they do a lot of service delivery. So some organizations do things such as, some women's organizations may do things such as provide a safe house for people who have been affected by domestic violence. So this is good because now the state doesn't have to do that. It kind of privatizes state functions. The state doesn't have to do some things if organizations are doing it. If you have literacy programs within civil society organizations, that's good, especially if there's special education programs, because then the state doesn't have to use taxpayer funds to do this. So there's this assumption that civil society is good for these things. But sometimes we may need to question these assumptions as well. And there is some literature that deals with interest groups that really does question the extent to which civil society and civil society organizations are always good for governance and even service delivery. And if we look at Haiti, Haiti is a really excellent case study in which a lot of questions are raised about how good civil society organizations are for service delivery when there are many, many non-governmental organizations, church groups, community-based organizations, international non-governmental organizations delivering services in contradictory ways. So that, there are these kind of questions that are avoided when we simplify too much. Also, this simplification and these sorts of uses ignore some things as well, such as the ways in which civil society has been used as a term, as well as civil society organizations has been used as a term to exclude certain groups of people. And a very good example of this for the Caribbean historically has been the exclusion of Rastafari, for instance, as some kind of deviant element in society that needed to be controlled and oftentimes excluded. And other forms of civil society were viewed as good and need to be included, even though there were also, let's say, faith-based types of groups, so church organizations. So in our parts of the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on including the church and church groups and so on. And this kind of masks relationships of power as well between groups that are viewed as respectable, people that are viewed as respectable, their ways of operating are viewed as respectable, and others who are not viewed as such or as much. We can even see this when we look at a broad policy area. We're addressing something like tourism. There may be a preference to speak to, if there is a consultation or collaboration, to speak to the types of organizations that are directly involved in tourism. Hotel Representative Association, for instance, or those types of groups, maybe Chamber of Commerce. But other people, other groups may be excluded because they're not viewed as having expertise in a particular area, even though they're affected. Or they may not be viewed as a respectable group that can engage well with policy. So we can talk here about, let's say, beach vendors, for instance, or people who are plaiting hair on the beach or giving massages and so on. Yeah, so there are these relationships of power that exist within civil society and civil society organizations, and I'm sure that you all operating within civil society organizations are aware of some of these as well. And especially if we go to the international level, we can see the disparities between different types of organizations, between smaller organizations such as those that exist in the Caribbean and very large international non-governmental organizations like Oxfam or Save the Children or any of the World Wildlife Fund. These really large entities that illustrate that some organizations can end up being excluded and their voice is not heard, just as some groups of people within civil society can be excluded. So the simplification sometimes masks some of the inequalities and some of the problems that people working in civil society, such as yourselves, might actually face. So these are some of the reasons why you may need to have a very clear and sharp advocacy and communication strategy to ensure that no matter how small your organization is or what policymakers or people within society may think about you or your work, that your message can get across, can get through some of these power dynamics and potential and existing exclusions. So all of that leads us to the fact that civil society organization, the CSO part, is a complex and contradictory term. And it is for this reason that some people prefer to just talk about non-governmental organizations so that we leave out all of that philosophical stuff and they focus on civility and all of that, or to focus on non-state actors. Yeah? Any questions or comments so far? Did anything that I said just speak to you or resonate or no?
Yes, it did.
Okay. If not, that's fine. I can move on. Does anyone want to say anything? Anybody else?
I just have a question.
Who's this speaking?
Sorry, Latoya Burnham.
Okay, yes, Latoya.
I'm wondering within, because I'm going back to the 3 circles that we would have had at the beginning, probably the second slide. Where would, for example, social enterprises fall within the context of civil society? And I'm talking about those organizations that serve or at least have a mandate that is social or addresses social issues, but where there is a concerted effort towards funding their own activities rather than seeking, that kind of resources outside. Where do those fall within the context of a civil society?
Right. So they are within civil society. But remember, I said there are these overlaps. So you're getting involved in as well.
And civil society then.
Pardon?
They would fall within the market and civil society then?
Yeah, you're still in civil society, but there are some overlaps because then you're getting involved in some market-based type activities.
Yeah.
You probably may want to have a business plan and strategy and so on, and kind of operate like a quasi corporate entity. But as you said, it's a social enterprise. So the profit is not being generated for shareholder value or to enrich whoever is the owner of this entity, but towards social means or towards some social end or cause or what have you. So still within civil society. But that's why we have these overlaps, because it's not always so clear that things can be easily separated from the state or the market. There are also many civil society organizations that get a lot of support from government.
Yeah. Okay.
This does not mean that they're not civil society organizations. They are, but they, sometimes people will raise questions about the extent to which they still are able to exercise a level of autonomy if they have a lot of government support. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is this, as I was saying in just before you asked the question, when we had this last slide that I will try to bring up again, that there is complexity in here. So it's just saying that we could simplify and move on leaves out some of these kind of overlap areas and gray areas that you do have to grapple with in real life. And when you're inside an organization, sometimes you may also have to ask yourself, do I continue taking funding from this entity? Is this sort of polluting what we have set out to do inside of this organization? Or are we too much emphasizing the enterprise side of what we're doing and too much under-emphasizing the social side? Yeah, so these are things that organizations and those who are leading them and working within them have to be really reflexive in thinking about as well. Are we still operating towards the ends of civil society? Or are we doing something else? Are we in this for personal enrichment? And these are some contradictory questions that people have to ask, because if you look inside of some organizations, there are people who are supposed to be working towards some social good or some cause, but they really are building a career and enriching themselves. And some small proportion of what is earned in the social enterprise is going towards a cause, but a large proportion is going towards their pocket. So, you have to really think and consider what are the aims and objectives, the mandates of this organization.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you too. All right, so, right, so why don't we just say non-governmental organizations? And here I say because all NGOs are civil society organizations, right? But not all civil society organizations are NGOs. I'll just leave you with that for a minute. Not all non-governmental organizations are, all non-governmental organizations are CSOs. I'm confusing myself. But not all CSOs are non-governmental organizations. So if we just say NGO, then we are leaving out some of the organizations that operate within civil society. And here are some examples. So trade unions, for instance, not NGOs. Trade unions kind of existed before this term non-governmental organization really became fashionable and something that people spoke about. Things like professional associations are not necessarily non-governmental organizations, but they are within civil society. Nurses associations, membership-based associations, of lawyers, bar association, medical professionals association, and so on. These are still within civil society. Because again, you're not thinking about the narrow self-interest, but you're thinking of the broader interest of, let's say, the profession and how the profession should serve society or operate or work within society. Yeah? And even business representative associations are not always necessarily non-governmental organizations, but they're still civil society organizations. So those are just some examples, and maybe when y'all leave here, you can go and think about some other types of entities that don't fit so well in this kind of NGO, non-governmental organization terminology. Now, the other term, NSA, that you may not be as familiar with, but is used a lot in the literature. This is non-state actor. So it basically says everything that's not the state. That's a lot easier than saying civil society with all of these things that qualify on the basis of civility and so on. But not all non-state actors are civil society organizations. All civil society organizations are non-state, but not all non-state actors are civil society organizations. I had question marks at the end of that to kind of ask y'all, is it right? But they're not really phrased as questions. So for instance, a business. If you have your business that you are doing cosmetology, or if you are a mechanic, you are not a state entity. But a business doesn't really fall within civil society. It's not a civil society organization as such. Criminal organizations and entities, a gang, a drug cartel, human traffickers, these are also non-state actors. People in the US, they talk about Al-Qaeda, and in Nigeria, Boko Haram, all these are non-state actors, but they certainly are not what we would call civil society organizations, because they are far away from the kind of civility tests that we would think about as important as operating within civil society organizations. Their aims are not, a lot of the aims are actually to terrorize and to do things that are criminal, and not because the law is unjust. Because sometimes civil society organizations do things that break the law, but the argument is that the law is unjust. Not because the law is unjust, but because they're involved in nefarious activity, trafficking people from one place to another. Yeah? And political parties. Now, there's some authors that include political parties within civil society organizations, and there is another camp that excludes them. I am kind of in the camp that excludes them because, as I said, as soon as your political party wins that election, you're no longer within the realm of civil society organization. You are controlling the state and controlling policy agenda and the distribution of resources and access to resources and so on. Okay? So we have some other terms that people use as well. I'm sure y'all are familiar with quite a few of these, all of them probably. The third sector. This is a way that, or the nonprofit sector, that often we think about the sector in which civil society organizations work in. Is a third sector. It's not the state, it's not the market or the economy, it's not the public sector or the private sector, it's a third sector. Is a nonprofit sector. So this is a term that is used, and I think both third sector and nonprofit sector they do very well in reflecting the idea of civil society and civil society organizations, unlike, let's say, non-governmental organization, and also unlike non-state actor, which can include for-profit entities, for instance. Third sector excludes for-profit entities in saying it's a third sector that's separate from the public sector and the private. So I think that term, I am very comfortable with if we're looking at alternate ways of talking about civil society and the organizations that operate within civil society. And then there are these others. I have this picture here of the alphabet soup, right? The alphabet soup. Because then we end up with all kinds of things. We already talked about CSO, NGO, NSA. Now we have CBO, more letters, community-based organizations, charities, foundations, philanthropic organizations. Each of these organizational types works in different ways. And although they are all civil society organizations, they work very differently, are funded differently, even their level of concern is different. Community-based organizations are very much micro in a lot of their work as well as concerns. Charities, foundations, philanthropies, philanthropic organizations, you may have a benefactor, for instance, who allows or funds the work of an organization. We have international non-governmental organizations. I mentioned those already. Yes, Erica? Erica, you have a question?
Sorry, I wanted to, when you get to business interest NGO, I wanted to understand if that would include nonprofits.
Sure. I talked a little bit about international non-governmental organizations. When I talked about Oxfam and Save the Children and so on, these are organizations that tend to have branches and operations in multiple countries. Some of them may operate in the region as well. I don't know if anyone in here is from a branch of an international non-governmental organization, but these are also within the realm of civil society, and they're quite interesting because of their ability to potentially influence both domestic as well as international policy making, decision making, and also agenda setting across a global community, if you think of us as that. So business interested non-governmental organization, bingo, right? You're asking if a nonprofit falls in there. I think when you ask that question, you're probably thinking about nonprofit in the way that it is used in some of the countries in the region. So when you all go on in the training and you do some of the more legal focused side, in Barbados, for instance, civil society organizations can register as either charities or a not-for-profit company. So basically a nonprofit. This is a kind of old way of thinking, and it's not very helpful for the ways in which many civil society organizations work, because there's an assumption that you are a social enterprise. And not all non-governmental organizations are. So when we talk about business interested, we're not talking about social enterprises. So we're not talking about nonprofits, i.e. organizations that may generate revenue to help fund themselves so they're self-sufficient and so on, right? We are talking about those that represent business interests. So kind of like Chamber of Commerce then. But a more contemporary way of some of these forming, rather than calling themselves things like business chambers of commerce or manufacturers associations, industry associations, is being business interested. So there may be a group that is created in the context of Barbados or other countries in the region where there have been these bans on single-use plastics. A group that is created to promote entities that create plastic or packaging products out of things like sargassum seaweed. In some ways, these are business interest NGOs, because they are, yes, not working in the individual self-interest of any one of the members, but working towards the interest of a certain sector or subsector, if you will, within the private sector. So there is that kind of overlap. Yeah? So nonprofit does not necessarily fall in there, but if you think about the legal framework in the Caribbean, things such as a Chamber of Commerce, a manufacturers association, and these kinds of business interested groups tend to be registered as nonprofits. So the legal terminology that we have in the Caribbean has not really kept up with the way in which organizational forms in civil society organizations have evolved. That's what I would say to that. So a lot of things are nonprofits in the Caribbean that would fall under these different categories. Even, for instance, international non-governmental organizations, sometimes that are registered in the region, are registered as nonprofit companies, because this is either that option or as a charity. and they don't often have the criteria that would allow them to legally register as a charity. Yeah? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm running out of time a little bit. I'm almost finished. So some of these are interested. A quasi-NGO. Have y'all ever heard of that? A quango? Anybody ever heard of that?
Yes.
Yeah? You know what it is? Can you tell us?
I don't know if I'm correct, but it's sometimes a mixture kind of it's a.
I'm not hearing you. Can you say again?
It's a sort of mix. It's an NGO that operates as a business, if sort of.
Yeah, sometimes people, a quasi-NGO is sometimes an NGO that is created by a business. These are the ones that you want to raise an eyebrow about. So during the 1980s and 1990s, early 1990s, for instance, in the USA, there were some NGOs, think tanks, research institutes that were created by the tobacco industry, by various firms, companies in the tobacco industry. Yeah? So as non-governmental organizations, but they receive their funding, their mandate, and so on from a particular company. So these ones, sometimes people raise eyebrows about what it is they're actually doing. Are they really working for the general good or interest group or cause, or are they serving somebody's interest? And in this way, we say quasi, right? Not quite non-governmental organization. Similarly, this one, GONGO, government organized non-governmental organization, is another interesting one because sometimes governments will form non-governmental organizations to work in an area that they believe is important to have people in society working on. So if the government of, this is just hypothetical now, I'm not picking on any country, but if the government of Grenada decides homelessness is a serious problem and the government can't address homelessness adequately, we are going to fund and create and get off the ground an organization that addresses homelessness so that people who are willing or interested or already working in this area can work within this organization. So the government organizes this non-governmental organization, a GONGO. And this is another one that people tend to raise eyebrows about because they ask questions about how far, is it just government organized or is it really the government pushing a particular agenda that does not reflect the concerns of civil society, organized civil society. Yeah? We have faith-based organizations. So here we can think about church groups. We can also think about Rastafari. So we had to say faith-based as opposed to like a church group or the church because we have several faiths. So you can have those Islamic women, all kinds of groups can exist. And also think tanks and research institutes. And people sometimes exclude these from civil society, but often they are quite important if we think about things like environmentalism. Research institutes and think tanks have been very important within civil society for raising awareness and the profile of issues. So how is it that most of us, or many of us, have come to believe that climate change is a real thing? And many more conventional non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations of various sorts, don't have the capacity to conduct the type of research that can support some of their claims. So think tanks and research institutes, again, operating not on the basis of profit and not working for the government either, have been very important for providing some of the information that is used to raise public awareness about particular issues, and that other types of civil society organizations can draw on in their advocacy and activism if that is what they do. Yeah? All right. Coming to an end here, We can think of civil society organizations also by what they do and by the issues that they address. And there's an author by the name of Glenn Bowen. You can look him up when y'all are finished here. He's Barbadian in origin, but he works in the United States of America. I believe he's a social worker, and he's done some work on some research on the different types of organizations that he sees as operating in the region. And he said the principal ones are basically service delivery organizations and advocacy and cause groups. But we also have social and recreational groups, which we have to remember are also part of civil society and civil society organizations. So the Footballers Association, Basketball Association, social clubs, sporting clubs, these are all part of civil society. And even if we don't always think about it, they do serve some very significant societal functions. If we think about things like the sporting club, if some children are not involved in some of these sporting activities, they might be involved in other things that would not be so good for society. So even though they tend to be apolitical, although they're not always apolitical, they may be very political on things like sport policy. They still form part of civil society and our civil society organizations. We have civil society organizations, this one on the far left, that are involved in service delivery. These have been very important in the Caribbean and have not often been acknowledged for how important they are in doing things that the state has not been able to do. So filling certain gaps in terms of so many things. As I said, we can talk about homelessness, we can talk about literacy and education and providing aftercare services for children and developing culture, providing cultural, so they deliver services that the state then does not have to deliver. Very many organizations in the region perform service delivery. And then we have those that are advocates, advocacy groups or cause groups. People working in these organizations may not necessarily, how do I say? So you can have people working in a youth group who are not necessarily youth, but they're working for the cause, right? So, or you have people working to address non-communicable diseases, and they don't have any non-communicable disease, but they're advocating for this cause. They want to directly attempt to influence policy and legislation oftentimes as well, and raise public awareness. So there are different types of groups. Not all of these groups engage in, so not all women's groups will engage in advocacy. Not all women's groups are service delivery organizations. Some of them may actually be social or recreational organizations. So that's why we have this big circle that has a lot of the issues. There are many other issues that CSOs can address, and they can address them from these types of approaches: service delivery, maybe social or recreational, or we have advocacy and cause groups. And that's really the end. Do you have any questions? We're now at 10 minutes past 3. Does anyone have any questions or comments on what I presented here?
No comments at this time. It's a lot.
Oh, yeah, it was a lot. But you have these slides that you can look back at. I also have 2 readings that I've asked to be made available to you. And if you go through the readings, a lot of this information will be reinforced. Okay. Anyone else have a question or comment? No? Okay. Well, this last slide is your activity, and this is not something that you have to hand in or anything. I just want you to think about these in your own time, right? You go back, you finish the session, you say, oh my gosh, that was a lot of information. She talked about so many things. I want you to try and reflect on these using these questions. How might an understanding of the concept of civil society affect the work of your organization? So you might say it has no effect at all. Nice to know, but doesn't influence me. But I'm just asking you, go back and think about it. Also think about how you would define your organization based on what we discussed today. So where does it fit? Is it a gongo? Is it one of these other things? Is it international non-governmental organization you're working in? Is it community-based? How would you define it? Do you do service delivery, advocacy? Do you do a combination? Are you social or recreational group? On what issue do you focus specifically? That's probably the easiest area. So those are two things just to go home and think about. And then thinking forward to sessions that will come in the future. So when you get to sessions that actually address the legislative areas as well as your communication strategy, I want you to think about this, to keep this in your head. So do different types of laws and legislative concerns affect different types of organizations differently? So on the basis of what you know now, what types of laws and legislative concerns might affect you and your organization, and how might these differ from the ways in which they would affect other organizations? So I know there are some people in here who are from organizations that deal with LGBTQ+ issues. So for your organizations, for instance, the Constitution may be very important, highlighting the ways in which perhaps some laws that are on the books in the region are unconstitutional and may violate some of your rights to privacy and freedom of association and all kinds of things, right? Beliefs. But for other groups, the Constitution may not be as important. Let's say you're dealing with an environmental group. Constitution may not be as significant. So in terms of your advocacy, you are probably not going to use the Constitution in your advocacy from an environmental organization. But you might use it if you are dealing with LGBTQ+ issues. Yeah? And the last one, does the way that you define your organization affect your communication strategy? So if you're a service delivery organization, does that affect your communication strategy differently from if your primary focus is on advocacy? So those are just things to think about as you go forward to sessions that will come. So that is it for me.
I please don't go yet. This is Erica. So Christina, thank you so much.
You're most welcome. My pleasure.
I just wanted, because I know I'm probably, this is Erica, probably been confusing you with emails, but I need to distribute the updated course outline, which includes the allocation to mentors. And it became a little confusing for me because I realized that all the CSOs haven't officially registered. Neither have all the actual participants. So then there were people or are people and or groups missing. So if you haven't officially registered your CSO or yourself, please do so I can ensure everyone is properly allocated. I'm giving you until, say, around 6 this evening, and then I will upload the revised course outline, which would have all the details and timetable, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, if I have to update it a little later, I'll just have to do that. But I was trying to avoid creating further confusion. Secondly, the mentorship group. So the mentors are Wendy, myself, and Christina. And the mentors are free to organize their sessions, etc. I can say I'll be contacting my group by tomorrow. I actually would like to meet next Monday or Tuesday. I know some of you are concerned about working through the worksheets, etc. So we will go through all of that. And essentially, the mentors are there to help you with your worksheets, and the worksheets are supposed to guide you towards developing your messaging strategy. So the worksheets are really, hello? Key.
Still here.
Oh, okay. So if you haven't registered, please register, but don't worry, you will get a new course outline. I think this may be the fourth point. We've set up a Google Classroom, again, to try to reduce the level of confusion. But if you're not comfortable or able with the Google Classroom, you let me know and I will still post the Dropbox. And then finally, there's someone who said, thanks to Christina, under the name Open EMIS. And I'm taking the register and I really need to know, who are you? What's your name? Open EMIS. Okay, well, if you hear me, you can email me and identify yourself. But I need to know so I can take a complete register. So Open EMIS, I would appreciate knowing what your name is. And that was all for me. I don't know if Wendy or Christina have anything to add. Thank you.
The only thing for me is, even though this might have been a lot of information in the session, remember we also have a tutorial. So if there's anything that you want to pick up on when we meet again, please write it down somewhere so that we can talk about it. And really, I would just like to thank you all for your attention. And if you have, remember we have this Google Classroom set up. So if there are any things that arise, you can also send us a note in there. And that's it for me.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say except to say thanks again for everybody for showing up for the session.
Good afternoon. I have one question. Would all of the future classes be around this time or during the middle of the day?
The aim is to actually vary the times because in theory, there are about 70 of you, and we can't find a time for everyone that's convenient for everyone. So we decided we would just vary the times and so on.
Hello, sorry, question relating to that then, because I didn't make the first session, but I listened in and you're talking about attendance and certificates and stuff, and how does that affect that? Because obviously not everyone can make every time, etc.
Right, so attendance, participation, when you get the new course outline, has the allocation for actual attendance is now 10%, and the majority is going to be based on worksheet completion. So you wouldn't be penalized too much, or you really wouldn't be penalized substantially in terms of attendance. At any rate, we want to know that you try to attend at least some of the sessions.
Understood, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wondering, I wasn't present last week, but I had the worksheet. I was wondering when it's due, the first worksheet.
I think Janelle was going to send us time. I told her, however, that I will agree to have some flexibility in terms of the first worksheet. So what I would like is that you at least have that first mentorship group meeting. And then once you meet with your mentors, Christina, Wendy, and I, we will discuss amongst ourselves and come back to you in terms of how we move ahead in terms of the schedule for worksheet completion. But I think it's important that you meet with your mentor first so that everyone is clear, because I know there's a lot of confusion, and also because the worksheets are supposed to be done as a group with your CSO. So we need to really pull you together and organize properly. So I would ask that you have the first meeting with your mentors, and then we will come back to you based on the feedback.
Okay, and just to clarify, you are the Miss Erica Smith, you are the mentor for CYDU, right?
Yes.
Okay, no problem. And when is the first
Who am I
meeting?
speaking with? Because I can't see who's speaking, sorry.
This is Adriana Avelez from Belize.
Okay, hi, Adriana.
So did I miss the first mentorship meeting or?
No, I'm going to send out that tonight. I'm thinking I'm going to aim for either Monday or Tuesday.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, I'm turning it back over to Christina.
All right, so if there are no other comments or questions, we will stop this recording, and that will be it for today. Does anyone have anything burning that they need to ask or say before we leave? No? All right, well, thank you everyone for your attendance, your participation, and your attention. And that's it for today. I will speak to you all again next time. So I'm ending the session. Bye, everyone.